In this video, we'll resume consideration of the macrostructures that help us understand the overall message and flow within the second sublecture, that is Proverbs 25:13 through 27:22. The sixth macrostructure in this second sublecture has to do with closure involving the term satisfied. It connects sections 2 and 3. The term satisfied appears twice in section 3. That occurs within the single verse 27:20, which reads, "Sheol and the underworld will not be satisfied, and the eyes of a mortal will not be satisfied." That double use builds on the occurrence of the term satisfied back in section 2. In chapter 27, verse 7, we read, "A satisfied appetite will trample on a honeycomb, but as for a hungry appetite, anything bitter is sweet." In this earlier use, that is 27:7, the sage indicates that one's receptivity to reproof will be conditioned by whether one feels smugly sated or whether one has preferably cultivated a robust appetite for correction. One's appetite for reproof should, the sage teaches, remain insatiable. The appetite that we find in 27:20, while insatiable, is unfortunately of a different and negative sort, since it is allied with Sheol and the underworld. Here, appetite awakens when the mortal's eye gazes on something desirable. There may be an allusion to the temptation scene from Genesis 3 implied here. The sage warned against just such a gaze early within the introductory sublecture. In chapter 25, verses 6 and 7, we read, "Do not put on airs before a king, and in the place reserved for people of prominence, do not stand. For it would be better if he were to say to you, 'Come up here,' rather than demoting you in the presence of a prince, someone whom your eyes regarded." Notice that expression, someone your eyes regarded. Again, that was 25, 6 and 7. The courtier whose eyes regarded the privileged status of a nearby noble would then be tempted to falsify his own portfolio in hopes of being promoted. Now in 27:20, the sage warns that such appetites for advancement, fueled by gazing on a more privileged person, amount to a formula guaranteeing unending dissatisfaction. They are like Sheol and the underworld that will not be satisfied. Notice the caution against self-praise that we find in the very next verse, 27:21. There we read, "A smelting pot corresponds to silver, and a small smelting furnace corresponds to gold, and an individual corresponds to his praising mouth." That's 27:21. What one chooses as the object of his praise, whether directing praise to self or to someone else, reveals, the sage teaches us, something very profound concerning that person. This teaching reinforces the likelihood that the appetite of the prior verse, 27:20, cautions concerning greed involving self-adulation, self-praise, and a desire for advancement, which was something that the eyes first longed for in their gaze as far back as 25, verses 6 and 7. We'll be returning to this verse 27:21 about refinement and the praise of his mouth in a few minutes. We'll make that a little more clear. The next macrostructural feature involves closure that connects the term praise, the term boasting, and the term glory. In so doing, it links sections 1, 2, and 3, that is to say, each section of this sublecture. Within the recap that comprises all of section 3, the sage identifies praise as a refining agent. 27:21 reads, "A smelting pot corresponds to silver, and a small smelting furnace corresponds to gold, and an individual corresponds to his praising mouth." In so doing, the sage is building on the semantic field of the word glory that figured significantly in sections 1 and 2, something that we talked about with an earlier macrostructure. The term boasting and the expression receiving praise merited mention even within an earlier recap portion. Notice verses 1 and 2 within the recap that spanned 27, 1 through 4. Verses 1 and 2 read, "Do not boast about yourself regarding tomorrow, for you cannot know what a day may bring forth. May a stranger praise you, and never your own mouth, a foreigner, and not your own lips." The fact that boasting and the concept of receiving praise appear in this recap further deepens the magnitude of closure that's generated by the term praise when we encounter it in the closing recap, which we read earlier, that is at 27:21. The next macrostructural feature has to do with closure that involves the terms fool and folly. These will connect sections 1 and 3. Unit 1B1, which spans 26:1 all the way through 12, is a unit devoted to the stupid person. Within it, 3 times the sage labels him with the term foolish. That occurs in verses 4 and 5. You see in verse 4, "Do not reply to a stupid fellow in a manner corresponding to his folly." There's our term for fool or folly. The same term recurs in the next verse, 26:5, and again the term folly occurs in 26:11. As a dog returns to its vomit, a stupid person repeats his folly. All of these are within block 1B1. We will next encounter this term in 27:3, which reads, "A stone is a heavy load, and sand is a burden, but a fool's angry response is heavier than both." This usage occurs within the second cumulative recap, 27:1 through 4, and provides closure for all of block 1B. In addition to this microstructural closure, a macrostructural closure obtains when, in the final verse of the final section, that is section 3, of this entire sublecture, the sage there recycles both fool and folly. We're looking now at 27:22, which reads, "If you were to pulverize a fool in a mortal with a pestle, together with hulled barley, his folly would not leave him." What we're observing here is that when we encounter fool and folly in the last verse of the entire sublecture, that has added impact because the sage has already introduced that character back in Unit 1B1 and with closure in 27 verse 3. We come now to the last of the macrostructures in the second sublecture, and this has to do with closure that's achieved through the concept of refining. It will connect sections 1 and 3. Through the concept of refining, the sage creates closure in section 3 at the last 2 verses of this second sublecture. In the last 2 verses, then verses 27, 21, and 22, we read the following. A smelting pot corresponds to silver, and a small smelting furnace corresponds to gold, and an individual corresponds to his praising mouth. If you were to pulverize a fool in a mortar with a pestle, together with hulled barley, his folly would not leave him. The sage has built towards this closure by accumulating multiple expressions related to refining, located both across this sublecture and even prior to it. The sage already was setting up the metaphor of metallurgic refinement as a prerequisite for any who desire to produce articles, or actually individuals, of magnificence. Here we're referring to chapter 25, verses 4 and 5, where it talks about the king removing undesirable elements, just as a refiner removes undesirable elements from the ore that he's refining. And also 25, 11, and 12, which talks about a silversmith producing precious articles from valuable metals. Continuing the metallurgic theme, the silversmith's artifice appears in negative fashion within section 1 of the present sublecture, when the sage describes the seductive litigant as a clever con artist whose glittering rhetoric amounts to a mere veneer, thinly skim coating a cheap vessel of clay. Let's look at that verse. It's 26:23. Here we can see 26:23, which is part of the portion that details the seductive litigant. It reads, "Silver consisting only of silver dross, which has been overlaid on earthenware, such are persons who set lips on fire with wrong motives." In verse 26 of the same chapter, we learn that such deception soon will be exposed for all to see. Both of these references stem from Unit 1B3. The sage next spotlights the refining process, or more accurately, raw materials which are incapable of improvement through refinement. That occurs toward the close of section 1 in chapter 27, verse 3. This reads, "A stone is a heavy load, and sand is a burden. But a fool's angry response is heavier than both." This saying extends the theme of refinement in two ways. First, it deals in mineral substances, sand and stone, as do the sayings that refer to precious ore products such as silver and gold. Second, it employs the root kaved in each hemistich. That is the term that here results in the words heavy and heavier. We want to keep in mind that this same Hebrew root yields the terms meaning glory, which we encountered earlier 6 times in the master lecture. If you're curious where that word glory appeared earlier, it's in the following places. In chapter 25, verse 2, it occurs twice. 25:27, it occurs twice. 26:1 and 26:8 also have the word glory. By bringing to the reader's attention the semantic field of minerals by mentioning stone, and here we are referring to 27:3, a stone is a heavy load. By bringing then to the reader's attention the semantic field of minerals through mention of stone, the sage here raises the prospect of raw material that may potentially yield something of value through refinement. But the sage then quickly, utterly dashes that possibility by assessing the worth of this stone not as glorious, with the root kaved, but merely as heavy, with that same root kaved. Worse yet, this fool For such is the person represented by the stone in 27:3. Part B reads, a fool's angry response is heavier than both. So, worse yet, this fool is inferior even to field stone, for despite imposing an equivalent burden of weight, he amounts to mere sand. His weight is the same as stone, but he actually consists of sand, which is a substance not suitable even for erecting a stone structure, let alone contributing to the monarchy a supply of quasi-ore, and here we're referring to raw character, which would be capable of refinement, that is, recruits, that eventually might turn into a valued courtier with the metaphoric magnificence of silver or gold. This fool is sand that cannot be improved on. The likelihood that by the terms stone and sand, the sage here implies that the fool's character is incapable of refinement. And here we're still pointing to chapter 27, verse 3. This likelihood grows even more probable in the light of the second hemistich. There we read that a fool's angry response is heavier than both. That is, heavier than both stone and sand, recalling the irony in the word heavier, since it stems from the same root as glory. Since refinement in this lecture, refinement of ore, serves as a metaphor for reproof of character, it is not difficult to detect what has provoked the fool to the angry response the sage mentions in this verse. It appears that someone has dared to reprove him, to refine him, thinking that the fool might welcome such help in refining his character. Sadly, yet predictably, the fool confirms his deep-seated folly by his arrogant unwillingness to receive gratefully that correction. Unwilling to admit and learn from his errors, the fool is consigned to mediocrity, for the path to magnificence necessarily transits the territory of correction. Thus it is that energies would be wasted attempting to refine such an individual. Located within a 4-verse cumulative recap that closes Block 1b, and here we're indicating that 27, 1 through 4 is a 4-verse cumulative recap. The double use of the root kaved in 27:3 in the terms heavy and heavier produces a microstructural closure that reaches back as early as the double use of that same Hebrew root kaved within the 4-verse cumulative recap that concluded the previous block, Block 1a. And here we're referring to the expression found in 25:27b, which reads, to search out their glory is glory. Keep in mind that the antecedent of their glory, indicates the glory of God and the King, which were anchored far back in 25, verse 2. As we reach this second sublecture's final 2 verses, that is 27, 21, and 2, the impact of macrostructural closure surrounding the theme of refinement intensifies when in this concluding section the sage identifies 2 sorts of furnaces used to refine precious ore. They appear in verse 21, a smelting pot and a small smelting furnace. The sage indicates that these metaphorically represent the courtier's own self. As we study the parallelism of verse 21, we find that the individual in the second hemistich, an individual corresponds to his praising mouth. That term individual stands parallel to a smelting pot and a small smelting furnace. So all 3 of those elements, smelting pot, small smelting furnace, and the individual, they all serve the same operative function. At issue here in the sage's teaching will be whether the courtier will subject his motives. Notice that motives figured in verse 19, just 2 verses earlier. Just as water reveals the face to that face, so the motives of a mortal reveal to that mortal. The refining process is something that reveals. So at issue will be whether the courtier will subject his motives and also his appetites. Appetites are in verse 20. Let's pause to reread that. Sheol and the underworld will not be satisfied, and the eyes of a mortal will not be satisfied. The expression satisfied point to appetites. So once again, at issue will be whether the courtier will subject his motives and his appetites to the figurative temperatures of the intensity needed to consume what is worthless dross within his character, so that sterling character may emerge from the refining process. The critical dimension of character that corresponds to the refined products of silver and gold, the sage here describes in verse 21 as his mouth's praise. What he's indicating is that the individual is the furnace, and what emerges from that furnace, corresponding to silver and gold in the first hemistick, what emerges from that furnace is his praising mouth. So as we watch what his mouth praises, we will be able to determine whether or not the refining process in his character has yielded something of rare value or whether it has failed. For the courtier's mouth may praise either self or someone else. The choice remains his. This choice of whom to praise is not a new dilemma within this sublecture. Already the sage has established the worthlessness of self-praise. We saw this as early as 25:6 in the introductory sublecture, and 27:1 and 2 in the present sublecture. 27:1 and 2, where he says, "Don't boast, and a stranger should praise you and not yourself." Conversely, the sage in this sublecture has also established the great importance of honoring others. So on the one hand, he's already cautioned, don't honor yourself, and he's also said instead one should honor others. This first emerged in the observation of 25:27b. There we read that enigmatic phrase, "To search out their glory is glory." And we discovered in connection with 25:2 that the persons that the sage is referring to by their glory is the glory of God and the King. So here in 25:27, which was toward the close of a significant portion, the sage is saying how important it is, if you're interested in magnificence, get your eyes off yourself and begin to explore the glory of God and the glory of the King. More recently, we see this same feature, getting eyes off the self and honoring someone in a higher station. This appears in the ultimate picture of healthy reproof relationships. And that appeared toward the close, in fact, the very final verse of the reproof relationships portion, that is 27:18. The last relationship that the sage showcases is that between a disciple and a master. It reads, "One who guards a fig tree will eat its fruit, and one who guards his master will be given glory." The disciple gets his eyes off himself, instead tends the fig tree, which is his master, and in so doing, he is privileged to eat of its fruit, which winds up meaning that he, the disciple, graduates into a condition of glory as he gets his eyes off himself. If then premium character evidences itself in praise that focuses on others and not on self, then the refining furnace operating within oneself must consist of the crucible of self-control. Like the contest surrounding praise, that is, the contest, the tug-of-war, will I praise self or will I praise others? The theme of self-control also enjoys well-established prominence already developed in this sub-lecture. Recall from 25:13 to 24, where the sage taught that self-control over greed constituted the character theme that was shared by the 4 relationships we found there. And in the final verse of that block, which was 25:28, the sage pointedly emphasized the critical nature of self-control. 25:28 reads, "A city which has been breached has no wall. Such is a person who has no restraint over his spirit." Praise that sinks to the level of elevating only self fails this lofty test of refined magnificence because it lacks self-control. On the other hand, praise that elevates someone else soars to the level of genuine splendor. The last piece in the mosaic of the topic of refinement is dismally dark. It occurs at this sublecture's last verse, 27:22, which reads, "If you were to pulverize a fool in a mortar with a pestle together with hulled barley, his folly would not leave him." Now the metaphor of refinement shifts from metallurgy to grain processing, where the inedible hull must be threshed from the kernel if it would yield useful food. Like grain that refuses to be separated from its hull, the fool remains impervious even to mortar and pestle, which envisions the most focused and confrontational energies of refinement. Truly, the fool only amounts to weighty but worthless sand, for which there exists no alchemy capable of transforming it into anything even remotely glorious. This concludes our study of the macrostructures operating in this sublecture. The next video will take up microstructural features.